The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above the concrete room, casting a sterile glow over a table crowded with laptops, printed satellite images, and steaming mugs of coffee that had long since gone cold. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and anticipation, the peculiar cocktail that always lingered before an operation. 12 men sat shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs, their uniforms a patchwork of dust and camouflage. They were warriors of the United States Navy SEALs, hardened by years of training and deployment, yet even they leaned forward in silence, listening. At the head of the room stood Commander Blake, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed. He radiated authority without ever needing to raise his voice. He tapped a laser pointer against the satellite image projected on the wall. The valley on the screen glowed white and gray, jagged lines of cliffs enclosing a scatter of buildings that looked like forgotten ruins. This, Blake began, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and desert air, is the Nuristan Valley. Remote, hostile, and it's where our target is hiding. The image shifted to a blurry photo grainy, captured a distance of a bearded man standing beside a mud brick compound. His dark eyes glared from beneath a turban, his expression cold. His name is Qadir al-Hassan, Blake continued. Insurgent leader. He's the mastermind behind 6 separate ambushes in the last 3 months. He's directly responsible for killing more than 24 coalition soldiers. Intel suggests he's planning something bigger, something that will destabilize the region. Our mission is simple. Go in, find him, and take him out. No capture. No second chances. A low murmur ran through the room. The words were familiar, the stakes clear, but the simplicity of the briefing never matched the chaos that would follow. Petty Officer Daniel Reyes sat in the middle row, silent, his eyes fixed on the projection. His hands rested on his knees, fingers drumming lightly. At 29, Reyes was lean, sharp-featured, and composed, with dark hair cropped short and a pair of calloused hands that had patched up more wounds than he could count. He was the platoon's corpsman, the medic, the one who always carried a heavier burden. Around him, his brothers leaned in with the usual mix of adrenaline and nonchalance. Some cracked quiet jokes to mask the tension. Others sat stiffly, already rehearsing the operation in their minds. Reyes remained still. He wasn't a man who cracked jokes before battle. He wasn't afraid either. What he felt was the weight of knowing that, by the time this mission ended, his hands would almost certainly be stained with blood. Whether it was the blood of his brothers or their enemies, that was yet to be decided. Blake clicked to the next slide, a top-down view of ridgelines and trails. You'll be inserted here by MD-47, he said, pointing with the laser. 0 dark 30. The valley's geography makes it a nightmare: steep cliffs on both sides, narrow passes, lots of blind corners. Expect choke points. Expect elevated fire. Local insurgents know this terrain better than anyone. They've been running fighters through it for years. Lieutenant Harris, the team leader, leaned forward. His square jaw flexed as he asked, "What's our support situation?" "Minimal," Blake admitted. "We'll have air cover on standby, but weather's unpredictable. There's a strong chance you'll be on your own once you're in." No one in the room flinched. The SEALs were used to fighting alone, used to the idea that backup was more a luxury than a guarantee. Reyes scribbled in his notebook, though his notes weren't about the target or the valley. He wrote down medical contingencies, number of units, potential extraction delays, likelihood of severe trauma given the terrain. For him, planning meant imagining the worst wounds his brothers might suffer and preparing to fight death itself to keep them alive. "Comes?" Another SEAL asked, encrypted. "But we've had reports of jamming in the area. Assume you'll lose signal at some point. Be ready to adapt." Blake let that sink in, then shifted his tone. This won't be easy. The enemy is dug in. They'll be expecting a fight. But they won't be expecting you. He let his gaze sweep across the room, catching each man's eyes in turn. You're the best of the best. That's why you're here. Reyes felt the words land with a familiar sting. He had heard them before every mission. He knew they were true his. Brothers with the sharpest edge of America's spear. Yet even the best bled. Even the best fell. He knew because he had been there, kneeling in the dust, holding pressure on wounds that couldn't be closed, watching the life fade from men who should have been invincible. As the briefing continued, Blake outlined the phases of the mission. Insertion, approach, reconnaissance, engagement. Each man was assigned his role. Reyes's was the same as always keep them alive. His backpack would carry tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, 4 kits, morphine, chest seals, scalpels. Enough tools to hold death at bay for a few minutes longer, long enough for an extraction, long enough for hope. When Blake finished, the room shifted from silence to motion. Chairs scraped, men stretched, weapons were checked and rechecked. The room buzzed with the ritual of preparation. Reyes remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the blurry image of Qadir al-Hassan. The man didn't look extraordinary. He could have been any villager, any farmer. But Reyes knew better. Evil didn't always wear a monstrous face. It often looked ordinary, human. That was what made it so dangerous. Reyes, Harris's voice broke his thoughts. The lieutenant stood over him, hand resting on the back of the chair. You good? Reyes looked up, nodded once. I'm good. Harris studied him a moment longer, then clapped his shoulder. We'll need you sharp tonight. The weight of those words pressed on Reyes more than the briefing had. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His entire existence in the SEALs was about being sharp when it mattered most. The hours before a mission always passed strangely too slow, then suddenly too fast. The men packed their gear, checked their weapons, said quiet words into phones. During last-minute calls home, Reyes didn't call anyone. He hadn't for months. Distance was a shield, and he needed it. Instead, he sat on his bunk, pulling apart his medical kit, repacking it piece by piece, making sure every vial, every bandage, every needle was exactly where it needed to be. His fingers moved with practiced rhythm, like a ritual. One of the younger SEALs, Mason, dropped onto the bunk across from him. You ever get tired of carrying that pharmacy around? He joked, nodding to Reyes's bag. Reyes gave a faint smile. Not as tired as you'll get if you ever need it. Mason chuckled, shaking his head. Fair point, Doc. The nickname Doc always followed Reyes. It wasn't official, but it was who he was to them, a man who brought them back from the brink. Hours later, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the platoon gathered once more. The briefing room was empty now, the images gone, but the weight of the mission remained. Harris addressed them one final time. This is it, boys, he said. We're going into the valley. We're going to cut off the head of the snake. Stay sharp, watch each other's six, and we'll all walk out of there together. The men nodded, silent, no cheers, no bravado. Just the quiet acceptance of warriors heading into the unknown. As they filed out toward the waiting helicopters, Reyes tightened the straps on his pack. His heart beat steadily, not from fear but from certainty. He knew the truth better than anyone. Once they touched down, chaos would come. His job wasn't to stop it. His job was to make sure his brothers survived it. And deep inside, though, he didn't know it yet, he carried something more than bandages and morphine. He carried the potential to change the course of the fight in a way no one could have predicted. Tonight would not just test his skills as a medic. Tonight, it would test the very boundaries of who he was. The night was alive with sound. The heavy thrum of the twin rotors rattled through the fuselage of the MH-47 Chinook, drowning out everything but thought. Inside, 12 Navy SEALs sat shoulder to shoulder, strapped to benches that lined the walls. Their helmets gleamed under the dim red cabin lights, their weapons cradled close, as if they were living extensions of their bodies. Each man was still, conserving energy, but the tension in the air was thick enough to feel against the skin. Petty Officer Daniel Reyes sat near the middle, his head tilted slightly back, eyes half closed. He wasn't asleep, not even close, but he had mastered the art of looking calm when his heart beat a steady drum beneath his ribs. His pack weighed against his shoulders, far heavier than anyone else's. Where others carried extra magazines or breaching charges, Reyes carried tourniquets, gauze, 4 kits, morphine, chest seals, and surgical tools. His job wasn't just to fight. It was to keep the rest of them alive long enough to fight another day. He opened his eyes as a sudden jolt shook the bird, turbulence rolling across the cabin like a giant's hand. Reyes's gaze swept over his brothers. Mason sat across from him, chewing gum like it might save his life, his eyes locked on nothing. Behind Mason, Carter the breacher rested his head against the steel wall, lips moving silently in prayer. Beside Reyes, Lieutenant Harris leaned forward, elbows on his knees, helmet tilted down, reviewing the mission plan in his mind for the 1000th time. No one spoke. There was no need. Words were wasted here, swept away by the deafening rotors. Each man had already retreated into himself, into the small place where fear wrestled with discipline, where courage was sharpened like a blade. Reyes adjusted the strap of his rifle across his chest. He always felt the contradiction of his role, most acutely in these moments. The weight of a weapon meant to take lives, paired with the weight of his pack meant to save them. He had fired his rifle before, killed when necessary. But his oath, his identity, was healer first. Tonight, though, something gnawed at him, a whisper at the back of his mind that his role might not be so simple. The Chinook's cockpit lit up briefly as the pilot's voice cut through the intercom. 5 minutes out. The words electrified the cabin. Men shifted, adjusting gear, checking magazines, tightening straps. The hum of motion filled the space, not chaotic, but precise. Each gesture had been rehearsed 100 times. A ritual of readiness. Reyes pulled his gloves tighter, then reached into his pack, patting the familiar outlines. Tourniquet, trauma shears, morphine, all there. He felt for the rifle slung across his chest. Full magazine, chamber ground, safety on. The red cabin light flickered as the ramp at the rear began to lower slightly, letting in a slice of frigid night air. It carried the scent of dust and earth, mixed with the faint tang of fuel and gun oil. Outside was Afghanistan's Nuristan Valley, black and silent beneath a canopy of stars. The Chinook roared lower, skimming along the ridgeline, its massive blades carving the air with bone-deep vibration. Reyes leaned to the side, catching a glimpse out the narrow window. Jagged cliffs rose like fangs on either side, dark silhouettes against the night sky. Somewhere down there, unseen, men with rifles waited. The insertion point was a flat stretch of ground nestled between boulders at the mouth of the valley. A tight landing zone. Risky, but there was no other option. The crew chief stood at the rear ramp, his hand raised in signal. 2 minutes. He bellowed over the thunder. Reyes's pulse quickened. He pulled down his night vision goggles, the world instantly shifting into an eerie green glow. Shadows sharpened into shapes, the ground below revealing itself in ghostly detail. The Chinook banked hard, then leveled. The pilot's voice came again. 30 seconds. Reyes's breathing slowed. Years of training took over, silencing the noise in his head, narrowing his focus. He wasn't thinking of Qadir al-Hassan, the insurgent leader, waiting somewhere ahead. He wasn't thinking of politics or strategy. He thought only of the men beside him, what they might face, how he would keep them alive. The ramp slammed down. Cold wind tore through the cabin, carrying the roar of the rotors into the night. "Go, go, go," the crew chief shouted. The SEALs surged to their feet as one. Reyes followed, boots pounding across the ramp and crunching into dirt and rock. The night air hit him like ice, his lungs searing with dust. They fanned out instantly, weapons up, forming a perimeter around the landing zone. The Chinook lingered for a heartbeat, its engines howling, then lifted, tilting sharply as it clawed back into the sky. Within seconds, it was gone, swallowed. By the cliffs, its roar fading into the distance. Silence fell. The only sounds were the crunch of boots and the faint rustle of gear. The SEALs crouched low, eyes sweeping the ridgeline, every shadow a possible muzzle flash. Reyes tightened his grip on his rifle, heart steady now. They were in. Alone. Lieutenant Harris raised a hand, signaling the squad forward. They moved. In staggered formation, their outlines nearly invisible beneath their camouflage and night vision glow. The valley stretched ahead like a scar in the earth, narrow and twisting. The cliffs rose high on both sides, sheer walls of stone that funneled them into a natural kill zone. Every instinct screamed ambush. Reyes stayed near the middle of the column, his position dictated by necessity. If someone went down, he needed to be close enough to reach them. His pack bounced against his back with every step, heavier now in the thin mountain air. They advanced in silence, broken only by the crunch of gravel and the occasional soft whisper, "Comes." Reyes's eyes scanned the shadows, his ears straining for sounds beyond their own. Minutes stretched, the valley deepened, narrowing further. The ridges loomed overhead, black and impenetrable. Reyes thought of the photo of Qadir al-Hassan, the bearded man with hard eyes. Somewhere ahead, beyond the ridges, the man was waiting. Waiting with fighters who knew every crevice, every blind corner. Fighters who had home field advantage. The SEALs pressed on, undeterred. They were hunters, and the valley was their arena. Reyes kept moving, one foot in front of the other, his body coiled tight, ready for whatever came next. He didn't know it yet, but before the night was over, the valley would earn its reputation. Before the night was over, the fight of their lives would begin. And he would be asked to become more than the medic who carried life in his hands. He would be asked to carry death as well. The valley swallowed them whole. Under the eerie glow of night vision goggles, the world was washed in shades of green. Every boulder became a crouched figure in Reyes's mind, every tree limb a silhouette of a rifle. His boots pressed into gravel, crunching with a sound that felt far too loud, each step echoing in his chest. The SEAL column moved like shadows, stitched to the ground, silent, deliberate, dangerous. Reyes kept his breathing slow, his rifle angled across his chest. His pack pulled at his shoulders, its weight a constant reminder that his purpose was different. Others carried explosives to break doors, or extra belts of ammunition to feed machine guns. Reyes carried morphine, scalpels, sutures. A battlefield pharmacy strapped to his back. Lieutenant Harris signaled a halt. The men froze, instantly sinking into cover behind scattered rocks. Reyes knelt low, following the angle of Harris's hand toward the ridgeline. Their movement, a flicker. Just for a heartbeat, Reyes's pulse jumped. His rifle pressed tighter against his shoulder, finger hovering near the trigger. But the shape melted back into the stone, too fast to identify. Harris tapped his radio mic. Possible contact. 11 o'clock, High Ridge. His voice was calm, almost casual, But Reyes knew what it meant. They weren't alone. The squad shifted, barrels rising, scanning. The valley was a throat, and they had just stepped into its mouth. For a few long seconds, the night was still. The only sound was the wind whispering through stone. Reyes' eyes strained against the green haze of his goggles. Nothing. No movement. No sound. And then the world cracked open. The first shot. Screamed down from the ridge, a white-hot tracer cutting the dark. It sparked against stone just feet from Harris, who rolled instinctively into cover. A second shot followed, then a third. Within a heartbeat, the ridgeline lit up with muzzle. Flashes, dozens of them, pouring fire into the valley. Contact left. Harris's voice thundered through combs. The SEALs erupted into motion. Their rifles barked in controlled bursts, muzzle flashes strobing against the green. The roar of suppressed fire was deafening, echoing between stone. Walls, dirt and gravel exploded around them as bullets chewed through the valley floor. Reyes' heart slammed against his ribs. He dove behind a boulder, the impact rattling his pack. The medic's instinct pulled at him instantly, not toward his rifle, but toward the scream that tore through the combs. Man down! Man down! Reyes sprinted, low and fast, toward the voice. Mason was down on the valley floor, blood dark against his sleeve, his rifle dropped to his side. Bullets snapped overhead like angry hornets. Reyes slid into the dirt beside him, already ripping. Open his pack. Talk to me. Reyes shouted, pressing a hand against Mason's shoulder. Through and through. Mason groaned, clutching his arm. Blood pumped between his fingers. Reyes' hands moved without hesitation. Gauze. Pressure. Tourniquet. He tightened the strap high above Mason's bicep, twisting until the blood slowed, then locked it in place. You're good, he said, voice steady. Stay with me. Keep your head down. All the while, the fight raged. Harris and Carter returned fire, the rifles hammering against the ridges. A grenade launcher thumped, sending a burst of smoke and flame into the rocks above. The enemy answered with their own volleys, bullets sparking against stone, rattling against armor plates. Reyes' eyes darted up. More SEALs were pinned down. The ambush had been perfect elevated positions, overlapping fields of fire, the valley acting like a funnel. They were caught in the jaws. Doc! Another voice screamed through the chaos. Reyes spun. 20 yards away, another SEAL, Torres, lay flat on his back, his chest plate shattered by a round that had punched through the edge. His breaths were shallow, wet, wrong. Reyes didn't think. He sprinted, dirt spraying behind him, bullets snapping inches away. He dove into the dirt beside Torres, ripped open his vest, and pressed a hand against the wound. Stay with me. Torres, he barked. Blood bubbled against his palm, warm and sticky. His brain calculated instantly. Sucking chest wound, collapsing lung. He yanked a chest seal from his kit, slapped it over the hole, pressed hard. Torres gasped, coughed. But air started moving again. Above them, the ridge continued to flash like lightning, insurgents pouring endless fire. Reyes glanced up and saw Harris crawl behind a rock, yelling into his mic. We're pinned. Need to push out. Reyes, status on casualties? Reyes' voice was ragged but firm. Too stabilized. Still mobile. But even as he said it, another round smacked into stone inches from his face, showering him with dust. The valley was killing them by inches. Then came the scream that froze Reyes' blood. Sniper down. Sniper's hit. He twisted eyes. Finding the silhouette of Cooper, the team's sniper crumpled against the dirt. The long rifle slid from his hands as he collapsed, motionless. The one man who could have turned this firefight into something winnable was gone in an instant. Reyes' breath caught. His world narrowed to a tunnel, the ridgeline erupting with muzzle flashes, the cries of his wounded brothers, the sniper's rifle lying abandoned in the dust. He shoved another bandage onto Torres's chest, pressed it down hard, and looked back at the fallen sniper's weapon. It was lying only yards away, gleaming in the night vision glow, a deadly lifeline waiting to be claimed. Rey's stomach twisted. His oath was healer. But in that moment, with the valley collapsing around them, he realized something with bone-deep clarity. If he didn't pick up that rifle, none of his brothers would survive long enough for him to save them. The valley had become a furnace of fire and stone. Tracer rounds slashed through the night like fiery needles, stitching the air with deadly precision. Every ridge spat muzzle flashes. The enemy dug in above them, pouring lead into the narrow throat of the canyon. The SEALs fired back with everything they had, but the fight was uneven. The ambushers had height, cover, and numbers. The SEALs had training, grit, and stubborn will, but none of it would matter if they couldn't break free of the kill zone. Reyes pressed his shoulder into a slab of rock, chest heaving, his gloves sticky with blood. Torres lay beside him, stabilized but barely conscious. Mason crouched against another boulder nearby, his wounded arm cradled against his chest, pale but alive. Reyes had done what he could for now, but each minute stretched the limits of survival. Blood seeped past bandages. Hearts faltered with shock. His hands, steady as steel, couldn't conjure miracles forever. A burst of machine gun fire ripped across the valley floor, spraying sparks where the rounds chewed through stone. Reyes ducked lower, his teeth clenched. "Overcomes," Harris barked order short, clipped commands meant to keep men alive. "Cover left. Push forward 20 meters. Carter, lay smoke." A grenade launcher thunked, hissing white smoke across the valley. It drifted like a curtain, swallowing half the battlefield. But even shrouded, the gunfire didn't stop. The enemy knew the terrain too well. And then Reyes heard it again, the call that still clawed at his chest. Sniper down. Cooper lay sprawled in the dirt, 10 yards ahead, motionless. His long rifle rested beside him, abandoned, gleaming faintly in the green glow of night. Vision, a perfect tool wasted. Reyes' stomach clenched. The sniper was the team's scalpel in the chaos, the one man who could cut through the enemy positions with surgical precision. Without him, the SEALs were fighting blind. And now, in the worst possible moment, they were crippled. Reyes pressed his head back against the rock, forcing breath into his lungs. He wanted to move, to crawl toward Cooper, to drag him back. But even as the thought formed, another volley of rounds sparked across the ground near Cooper's body. Anyone who tried would be torn apart. Harris's voice crackled over Combs, low and tense. "We need to move. We're sitting ducks out here." A pause, then quieter, almost to himself. "Damn it, we've lost eyes." Reyes knew what he meant. Without the sniper, every push forward was blind. Every step risked more men going down. The mission hell, their survival was unraveling. He looked at his hands, slick with Torres's blood, trembling now only because they wanted something to hold. He wasn't a sniper. That wasn't his role. He was the medic, the lifeline. He was supposed to save his brothers, not pick up a weapon that dealt death from the shadows. And yet, hadn't he always known this moment might come? Memories surged unbidden. Hours on the range, long after training drills ended, when he stayed behind to practice. Cooper had even teased him once, "Doc, you sure you don't wanna trade kits with me?" Reyes had shrugged, hiding the truth. Part of him had always wanted to see if he could. And every time his shot struck true, he felt a strange mixture of pride and guilt. Pride for the skill. Guilt because he was supposed to be different. Now, in this hellish valley, that choice stared at him in the form of a rifle lying in the dust. Another scream cut through the Combs. I'm hit. A seal cried out from the right flank. Reyes' heart lurched. He pressed harder into the rock, torn in two. He wanted to sprint toward the voice, to drop his pack, to work his hands like a surgeon under fire. But as he scanned the ridge through his NVGs, he saw the flashes, the constant stream of fire from a single elevated nest that had them pinned. If that gun wasn't silenced, no amount of bandages would matter. They would all die where they crouched. Reyes! Harris's voice barked. Citrip on the wounded. Reyes keyed his mic. 2 critical, 1 stable. I can keep them alive. For now, but he cut himself off, glancing toward the sniper's rifle. His voice was low when he finished. We won't last much longer like this. A crack split the night as another round smashed into stone inches from his head, spraying his goggles with dust. His ears rang, and for an instant he felt the void, the thin line between alive and dead. That was the breaking point. Reyes slung his rifle to his chest, adrenaline burning through hesitation. He crawled low, dirt grinding against his armor. As he surged forward, staying tight to the rocks, bullets whipped overhead, one snapping so close it felt like it parted the air at his ear. His chest heaved, lungs clawing at the thin mountain air. Reyes, where the hell are you going? Harris shouted. Trust me. Reyes snapped back, though even he wasn't sure what he was doing. He reached Cooper's body. The sniper lay still, eyes glassy, chest unmoving. A gut punch Reyes couldn't afford to feel. Not now. Gritting his teeth, he pulled the long rifle from beneath Cooper's slack arm. The weapon was heavier than he remembered, cold steel pressing into his gloves. He dropped behind the nearest rock, heart hammering. His hands moved automatically slide. The bipod down, check the chamber, adjust the scope. It felt both alien and familiar, like slipping into someone else's skin that still somehow fit. Reyes peered through the scope, the green haze narrowing into a perfect sight picture. The ridge loomed large in his vision. Shadows moved behind rocks, muzzle flashes blooming like fireflies. He tracked one steady, calm, breathing slow. He remembered Cooper's advice. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Reyes squeezed the trigger. The rifle thundered, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the figure collapse backward, weapon clattering from lifeless hands. One nest silenced. Who the hell? Harris's voice broke across comms, stunned. But Reyes was already shifting, adjusting his aim to the next flash. Another squeeze. Another enemy fell. Something inside him shifted. The fear that had gripped his chest melted into focus. Each breath steadied him, each shot more precise. He wasn't abandoning his oath. He was fulfilling it in a new way. With every pull of the trigger, he wasn't taking life, he was protecting it. Every enemy who fell meant one less bullet tearing through his brothers. Behind him, Torres coughed weakly, still alive. Mason held pressure on his bandage, still breathing. And all around him, the SEALs fought harder, inspired by the sudden return of death from above. Snipers back online. Carter shouted, disbelief in his voice. Harris didn't correct him. He didn't need to. What mattered was simple. The fight had balance again. Reyes pressed his cheek tighter to the stock, his eye never leaving the scope. The valley hadn't let go of them yet. But for the first time since the ambush began, survival felt possible. And as the rifle thundered again, Reyes accepted the truth he had been running from his whole life. Sometimes a healer's duty wasn't only to save lives with steady hands. Sometimes it was to pick up a weapon and make sure there were still lives left to save. The medic had become the sniper, and the battle had just changed. The rifle was alive in his hands. Reyes crouched behind the jagged stone, cheek pressed to the stock, finger resting light against the trigger. Every heartbeat felt like an eternity, every breath like a countdown. Through the scope, the world narrowed into clarity. Shadows flickering against the ridgeline, muzzle flashes blooming like fireflies in the night. For the first time since the ambush began, the valley no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a battlefield Reyes could shape. The medic had always been defined by his hands, their steadiness, their speed, their refusal to falter when life hung by a thread. Tonight, those same hands proved steady in a different way. Where once they had pressed gauze into open wounds, now they guided crosshairs onto targets. Where they had stitched flesh, they now stitched death into the night. He squeezed the trigger again. A man toppled backward, his rifle clattering into the dust. Reyes exhaled slow. The recoil absorbed into muscle memory he hadn't realized was burned so deeply into him. He shifted, sighting another muzzle flash, and fired. Another target fell. Snipers online again. Carter shouted over comms, disbelief dripping from his voice. Harris's reply was sharp, but not questioning. Keep up the fire. Push forward while they're distracted. The teen surged with renewed force, rounds hammering into the rocks above. Grenades arced upward, booming against enemy nests. For the first time in what felt like hours, the balance tilted. But Reyes couldn't let himself drown in triumph. He forced his focus back onto the scope, onto the rhythm that kept his brothers alive. Breathe in, hold, squeeze, exhale. Again. Again. Still, his medic's instincts never loosened their grip. Out of the corner of his vision, he saw Mason shifting awkwardly, clutching his wounded arm. Torres coughed weakly, the chest seal fluttering with every ragged breath. Reyes's heart pulled toward them toward the oath he'd sworn. But another burst of gunfire chewed into the ground beside Torres, and rage ignited in his chest. If he left the rifle, they'd die anyway. He whispered under his breath, as if reminding himself, every shot I take keeps them alive. Another figure popped above the ridge. Reyes tracked, fired, dropped him. His hands didn't tremble. It was a strange duality, one that twisted his gut even as it sharpened his purpose. For years, he had defined himself by one truth. He was the man who stopped bleeding, who brought men back from the brink. Killing had always been secondary, necessary only when there was no other choice. But here, in this valley, killing was saving. There was no separation anymore. He thought of something Cooper, the sniper now lying dead beside him, had once said after a long night of practice on the range. It's not about pulling the trigger, Doc. It's about what happens after. Every round has meaning. Make sure yours counts. Reyes pressed his cheek tighter to the stock. Tonight, every round counted for the brothers bleeding at his side. Doc, Harris's voice cracked across comms. How's Torres? Reyes shifted the rifle just long enough to glance at the man. Still breathing. Hold the line, I'll check him in 30 seconds. Copy that. Another flash. Another shot. Another enemy gone. Reyes's breathing slowed into rhythm, his heartbeat syncing with the pull of the trigger. The valley, once chaos, began to fall into patterns. Movement, muzzle flash, squeeze, silence. But the fight was far from over. The insurgents weren't fools. They realized quickly their dominance was slipping. Shouts echoed across the ridgeline, sharp and urgent. Fire shifted, focusing heavy on Reyes's position. Rounds cracked into the stone around him, spraying dust across his goggles. One clipped. The edge of his pack, tearing fabric. Another sparked inches from his boots. They had found him. Reyes ducked lower, lungs tight. For a moment, panic tried to claw through his chest. He wasn't trained for this, not like Cooper had been. What if his luck ran out with the next volley? But then Torres gasped behind him, a sound that cut deeper than any bullet. Reyes clenched his teeth. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, they all stopped. He slid sideways along the rocks, finding a new angle. The rifle steadied against stone, his scope swinging toward a heavy machine gun, tearing into Carter's position. Reyes inhaled, held, squeezed. The gunner's head snapped back, his body tumbling down the ridge. The machine gun fell silent. "Nice shot, Doc," Mason shouted, voice strained with pain but alive with awe. Reyes didn't answer. He couldn't. If he let himself hear the praise, the weight of what he was doing would crush him. He focused instead on the next target, and the next. Minutes bled into each other, the firefight stretching on like an eternity carved into seconds. Reyes shifted between roles with desperate precision sniping enemies, then crawling back to Torres to check the seal, then firing again. When Mason's arm began bleeding through his bandage, Reyes darted over, tightened the tourniquet, shoved morphine into his thigh, then scrambled back to the rifle. It was madness. It was impossible. And yet, somehow, it worked. The team pushed forward, step by bloody step. Harris called maneuvers. Carter laid down suppressive fire, and Reyes cut holes in the enemy's defense, one shot at a time. The valley that had begun as their tomb was slowly becoming their battlefield again. Still, every trigger pull burned deeper into Reyes' soul. He told himself the truth he needed to survive. "I'm not killing. I'm saving." But deep down, he knew he was walking a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When at last there was a lull, a brief pocket of silence between volleys, Harris's voice came over comms, firm and clear. "Reyes, that you on the long rifle?" Reyes hesitated, breath caught in his throat. He could have lied. He could have said Cooper had managed a few last shots. But what was the point? "Yes," he said finally. His voice was low, steady. "It's me." A pause. The only sound was the crackle of comms. Then Harris spoke again. "Keep shooting." 3 words. Permission. Validation. Command. Reyes closed his eyes briefly, then lowered them back to the scope. The medic had made his choice. The night raged on. The insurgents pressed harder, unwilling to give up their ambush. But the SEALs no longer fought blind. Reyes' rifle sang through the valley, its thunder echoing against stone. Each shot carved space for his brothers to move, each kill a heartbeat bought for the wounded he refused to abandon. By the time the stars shifted overhead, Reyes had become something new. Not just the medic, not just the man who healed. He was the bridge between life and death, the one who carried both in equal measure. The choice had been made. There was no going back. And in that crucible of fire and blood, Daniel Reyes understood the cost of survival. Sometimes a medic had to save lives by taking them. The valley was no longer just a kill zone. It had become an arena, and the SEALs were fighting their way out inch by bloody inch. Smoke hung low, mixing with the dust kicked up by grenades. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of spent brass and the sharper stench of blood. Reyes crouched behind his slab of rock, his cheek welded to the stock of the long rifle. His eyes, bloodshot from hours without rest, burned through the scope. He wasn't just pulling triggers anymore. He was guiding the rhythm of the fight. Every shot was a drumbeat. Every enemy he dropped gave his brothers space to push forward. The rifle had become an extension of his will, just as his medkit had always been. But Reyes wasn't blind to the cost. Every shot reminded him of Cooper's lifeless eyes staring up at the stars. Every kill carried a weight that pressed heavy on his chest. And still, he squeezed the trigger, because the alternative was death for everyone around him. "Doc, keep their heads down." Harris barked over comms, voice cutting through the static. "On it," Reyes muttered, sighting a fighter darting between rocks. He squeezed, the rifle bucked, and the fighter crumpled mid-stride. "Push left." Harris shouted to the others. "Carter, Mason, with me. Reyes, keep overwatch." The team surged, dragging Torres with them, his breath shallow but stubbornly present. Reyes covered them, picking targets with surgical precision. The insurgents, realizing their ambush was slipping, poured fire down the slope. Bullets hissed overhead, smacking into stone, chewing the ground around Reyes. He shifted positions, sliding on his stomach, dragging the rifle with him. The valley floor scraped against his armor, tearing fabric and skin alike. He barely noticed. All that mattered was angles, lines of fire, opportunities to cut down threats before they reached his team. A burst of gunfire erupted from the ridge. Above, Reyes tracked, spotted a machine gun nest lighting up Harris's path. He exhaled, squeezed. The gunner's head snapped back, body tumbling, but another fighter slid into his place. Reyes shot again and again until the nest was silent. "Machine guns clear," Reyes called. "Copy," Harris replied. His voice carried a new tone, now not just command, but trust. The SEALs pushed harder, grenades arcing into caves, rifles barking in controlled bursts. The enemy's advantage of terrain was slipping with every inch the Americans claimed. Reyes's rifle was the scalpel cutting their way through. And yet, the insurgents weren't breaking. If anything, their fire grew more desperate. Shouts echoed across the ridges, angry and defiant. They weren't fighting to hold the valley. They were fighting to bury the SEALs in it. A sudden thud shook the ground. An RPG slammed into the rocks near Carter, the blast tossing him backward. Dust swallowed him in a choking cloud. Carter's down. Mason shouted, panic cracking his voice. Reyes's gut twisted. He tore his eye from the scope, scrambling across the rocks to where Carter lay sprawled, groaning, blood seeping from shrapnel wounds across his chest and leg. Reyes dropped the rifle, ripping open his medkit. "Stay with me, Carter." Reyes, arced hands already working. He pressed gauze into the chest wound, slapped on a seal, wrapped a tourniquet high on the leg. His hands moved fast, automatic, even as bullets whined overhead. "Doc, we need cover," Mason shouted. Reyes's jaw clenched. He glanced at the rifle lying beside him, still within reach. His heart hammered with the impossible truth. He couldn't do both at once. Heal and kill. Protect and destroy. But if he chose wrong, they'd all die. He pressed the tourniquet tighter, watching Carter's pulse steady. It was enough for now. "Hold pressure," Reyes ordered Mason, shoving Carter's leg into his grip. "Don't let go." Then he snatched the rifle, swung it back onto the rocks, and dropped behind the scope. An insurgent had crept forward, aiming down into Harris's position. Reyes fired, the round punching through his chest. Another enemy lunged behind him. Reyes shot again, then again. The valley thundered with overlapping chaos explosions, screams, the pounding rhythm of the SEALs clawing forward. Reyes lived. In the space between, crawl to a brother, stop the bleeding, crawl back to the rifle, fire until the ridge fell silent. Over and over. His body ached, his muscles screamed, but he refused to slow. Hours blurred. The moon climbed higher then, dipped toward the horizon. The fight stretched on like a nightmare that refused to end. And yet, somehow, the SEALs endured. At last, Harris's voice crackled over comms, hoarse but steady. "We've got them falling back. Keep pressure." Reyes peered through his scope. The ridge, once blazing with muzzle flashes, was growing quieter. Shadows darted away, scrambling higher into the mountains. The insurgents were retreating, but Reyes's relief was tempered by exhaustion. He had no strength left to celebrate. His hands trembled on the rifle, his chest heaving. Around him, the team was battered, bleeding, but alive. Carter still groaned, Mason clutched his wounded arm. Torres clung to each shallow breath. And Harris? Harris stood tall, scanning the ridge, a grim smile on his dirt-streaked face. "They're running," Harris said, almost to himself. "They know we're not dying here." Reyes lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. His hands shook violently now, not from adrenaline, but from the crushing release of survival. He looked at the weapon, stained with blood and dust, and felt the full weight of what he had done. He was a medic. And yet, tonight, he had killed more men than he had ever saved in his career. "Doc," he looked up. Harris crouched beside him, eyes hard but not unkind. "You saved us tonight, all of us." Reyes opened his mouth, but no words came. He wanted to argue, to say Cooper had saved them with the rifle he'd left behind, or that it was the team's grit, not his trigger finger, that turned the tide. But deep down, he knew Harris was right. He had made the choice, the impossible choice, and it had carried them through. But the cost of that choice was carved deep into him, a scar no bandage could cover. Dawn bled slowly across the valley, painting the jagged rocks in pale light. The SEALs moved cautiously now, securing their wounded, scavenging what gear they could, always watching the ridges for signs of another attack. Reyes knelt beside Torres, checking his pulse, adjusting the chest seal. Still alive. Barely, but alive. He moved to Carter next, changing the dressings, checking for new bleeding. Alive. Mason, too weak, but stable. He had saved them. All of them. And yet, when Reyes sat back on his heels, staring at his blood-caked gloves, he felt hollow. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He was still their medic, but now he was something more, something darker. He had become their shield and their sword. And though the fight in the valley was ending, Reyes knew in his bones that the war inside him had only just begun. The valley was silent now. Not the peaceful kind of silence Reyes remembered from his childhood nights in Texas, lying on the porch with cicadas buzzing and stars wheeling overhead. No, this silence was sharp, empty, broken only by the occasional moan of a wounded man or the distant shuffle of retreating feet high in the mountains. The battle was over. But the war inside Reyes had only just begun. He sat slumped against a jagged rock, rifle laid across his lap, hands still trembling. His gloves were caked with a mix of dust, sweat, and blood, some his own, most belonging to the brothers he had fought to keep alive. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, each inhale catching, as though the weight of the night pressed harder than his lungs could bear. Around him, the SEALs moved like ghosts. Harris paced near the edge of the rocks, rifle raised, scanning the ridges with the stubborn vigilance of a man who refused to believe it was truly over. Mason sat with his back to a boulder, cradling his bandaged arm, eyes half closed but burning with adrenaline. Carter lay flat on his back, pale but alive, his chest rising and falling under the tight seal Reyes had placed hours earlier. Torres still clung to life by threads, so thin Reyes was afraid to look at him for too long. It should have felt like victory. Against all odds, they were still breathing. The ambush hadn't swallowed them. But Reyes didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. His gaze fell on the rifle across his lap, the long, sleek weapon that had once belonged to Cooper, the same rifle that had turned him from medic to executioner in the span of a single night. Its barrel was blackened from use, its scope streaked with dust, its stock marked by scratches and dried blood. Reyes couldn't decide if it felt like a lifeline or a curse. "Doc," the voice pulled him from his thoughts. Harris stood a few feet away, silhouetted against the pale blush of dawn. His eyes, tired but sharp, locked on Reyes. "You good?" Reyes wanted to laugh. The question was absurd. No one was good. not after what they had just endured. But he swallowed the bitter retort and gave the answer Harris needed. "I'll manage." Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded. He crouched down close enough that only Reyes could hear him. "You did what had to be done. Don't carry it heavier than you need to." Reyes's jaw tightened. He looked away, eyes tracing the jagged line of the ridgeline where bodies now lay sprawled. "I was supposed to save lives, not take them." "You did save lives," Harris said firmly. He gestured to Carter, Mason, Torres. "They're here. Because of you. You think Cooper wouldn't have wanted his rifle in your hands if it meant keeping us alive? Hell, Doc, you honored him tonight." The words struck hard, like a hand pressed against a wound. Reyes wanted to believe them. Part of him even did. But another part whispered that he had crossed a line no medic should ever cross. Harris must have seen the turmoil in his eyes, because his voice softened. "We all walk away from nights like this with blood on our hands. What matters is what we do with it after. You carried us, Reyes. Don't forget that." Before Reyes could reply, static hissed in his earpiece. Then a voice, sharp and distant. "Bravo team, this is Overlord." "Citrip, over." The sound was like a lifeline thrown into dark waters. Harris straightened immediately, pressing a hand to his earpiece. "Overlord, this is Bravo 1. Multiple casualties, heavy engagement. We need immediate extraction. Coordinates. Transmitting now. Copy, Bravo 1. Stand by. Bird inbound. ETA 30 mics. Hold tight. 30 minutes. Half an hour to wait in this broken valley. 30 minutes to guard the wounded and pray the enemy didn't regroup. The team shifted into a tense defensive posture. Harris and Mason took up watch positions on the perimeter, scanning the slopes for any sign of movement. Reyes crouched between Carter and Torres, checking vitals, refreshing bandages, whispering words he barely believed himself. "You're not dying here," he murmured to Torres, pressing a fresh dressing against the chest wound. "Not after. Everything? You hang on? You hear me?" Torres's eyes fluttered open for a moment, glassy but determined. His lips parted, a whisper escaping. "You still talking too much, Doc." Reyes's throat tightened. He forced a small smile, shaking. His head. "Yeah, and you're still too stubborn to die." Minutes crawled like hours. The sky grew brighter, the ridges sharp against the rising sun. The silence remained heavy, broken only by the occasional cough, groan, or the metallic click of weapons. Being checked and rechecked. Reyes's mind wouldn't still. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes the recoil of the rifle, the faces of the men he'd dropped through the scope, the way their bodies had crumpled. He told himself again, and again it had been necessary, that each trigger pull had bought his brothers another breath. But necessity didn't erase the images. When the distant thrum of rotor blades finally reached their ears, the entire team stirred as one. Relief washed through them, sharp and fragile. Harris signaled with a flare, the red smoke curling into the morning air. The helicopter appeared moments later, a dark silhouette sweeping across the valley, rotors chopping the silence into thunder. As the bird descended, dust whipped into the air, stinging eyes and lungs. Reyes shielded Torres with his body, then helped Mason drag Carter toward the waiting extraction. Harris covered them, rifle raised, every muscle tight, in case the enemy chose this moment to strike again, but no fire came. No shadows moved on the ridges. The valley was still. The SEALs loaded their wounded first Torres, strapped into a stretcher. Carter hauled aboard with Mason's help. Reyes climbed in after them, hands never leaving his patients. Harris was the last aboard, eyes sweeping the battlefield one final time before he pulled the door shut. The helicopter lifted, rising above the jagged rocks, carrying them away from the valley that had nearly become their grave. Inside the bird, the noise was deafening rotors, wind, the crackle of combs. Yet Reyes felt detached, as though wrapped in glass. He worked on Torres mechanically, adjusting forelines, checking vitals, pressing gauze into wounds that still bled. His hands moved with the same precision as always, but his mind was elsewhere, tangled in shadows. He caught Mason watching him once, eyes full of something that wasn't quite gratitude, wasn't quite fear. It was awe, maybe, or confusion. The look of a man who had seen someone become something entirely new in the span of a night. Reyes didn't know what to do with that. When at last the bird banked toward the safety of a forward operating base, Harris crouched beside him, one hand gripping the metal frame for balance. He leaned close, voice cutting through the roar. "You did more than your duty tonight, Reyes. Don't let the weight of it break you." Reyes didn't answer. He stared down at his bloodied hands, and at the rifle strapped to his chest. Cooper's rifle. His rifle now. The medic had chosen to become a sniper. And though they were leaving the valley behind, Reyes knew he would carry the echoes of that choice forever. The aftermath wasn't silence. It wasn't peace. It was the knowledge that survival always came with a cost. And Reyes, more than anyone, understood just how heavy that cost could be. The base was a blur of noise and movement when the helicopter touched down. Floodlights carved the dawn into harsh white beams, illuminating the landing pad as medics rushed forward with stretchers. The SEALs moved quickly, voices raised over the roar of engines. Carter and Torres were carried away first, IVs swinging as military doctors barked orders. Mason followed under his own power, clutching his arm, but refusing the stretcher with the stubborn pride only a SEAL could muster. Reyes climbed down last, boots hitting the concrete with a weight that felt heavier than his body. The rotors battered him with hot wind, pulling at his uniform, tugging at his rifle sling. He looked down at the weapon, hanging across his chest, its metal frame dull in the artificial light, and felt the contradiction burning inside him all over again. A medic approached, clipboard in hand. "Doc Reyes? You're needed in triage. Now." Reyes blinked, his mind still in the valley. He wanted to say no, wanted to crawl into silence, to bury himself somewhere no questions could follow. But muscle, memory overrode him. He nodded once, followed the medic inside, and within seconds was back in motion, hands covered in blood, chest seals pressed into flesh, sutures pulling torn skin back together. Hours blurred. Patients cycled through the triage bay, each one demanding the kind of split-second decisions Reyes had trained his whole life to make. His hands never faltered, his eyes never drifted. Outwardly, he was the medic he had always been. Inwardly, he carried something new, something heavier. When at last the rush slowed, he peeled off his gloves, tossed them into the red bin, and staggered toward the edge of the bay. He leaned against a wall, head bowed, chest heaving. His reflection stared back from a polished steel cabinet, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, streaked with blood and sweat. He barely recognized himself. That night, long after the wounded were stable, and the base had quieted, Reyes sat alone outside the barracks. The desert sky stretched endless above him, a tapestry of stars far too beautiful for a place stained with war. The rifle lay across his knees, cleaned and reassembled, every piece polished with ritual precision. He thought of Cooper, steady, calm, always quick with a joke to cut the tension. Cooper should have been here, cleaning his own rifle, ribbing Mason about his aim, teasing Reyes about being too serious. Instead, Cooper was a ghost, and Reyes was holding the weapon that should never have been his. "Can't sleep?" Harris's voice drifted out of the dark. The lieutenant approached, quietly, carrying 2 mugs of black coffee. He set one down beside Reyes, before lowering himself onto the bench. Reyes took it wordlessly, the bitter liquid scalding his throat, anchoring him in the present. "You keep looking at that rifle like it's a curse," Harris said finally. Reyes's eyes stayed fixed on the stars. "Maybe it is." Harris shook his head. "It's a burden. Big difference. Curses destroy you. Burdens test you. And you, Doc, you carried all of us through hell with that thing. Reyes didn't." Reply. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of generators and the whisper of desert wind. Harris leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think Cooper didn't know the risk every time he pulled that trigger? That he didn't wrestle with it afterward? Don't fool yourself, Reyes. Every man who's ever looked through a scope in combat carries ghosts. You're not unique. But what you did, you saved lives. That's what'll matter when the smoke clears." Reyes turned then, eyes hard. "And when the ghosts don't fade?" Harris met his stare without flinching. "Then you honor them. You live in a way that makes their sacrifice worth it. That's all any of us can do." The words lingered long after Harris left. Reyes sat under the stars until the horizon bled. With the first light of dawn, the rifle still across his lap, the weight of it both anchor and chain. Weeks passed. The mission debrief became a tangle of paperwork, quiet commendations, and careful omissions. Official reports reduced the Valley ambush to sterile phrases: enemy contact, casualties sustained, mission success. The chaos, the fear, the transformation of a medic into a sniper, all of it vanished between the lines, swallowed by bureaucracy. But the men who had been there remembered. Carter, recovering from his chest wound, clapped Reyes on the shoulder one afternoon in the mess hall, eyes sharp with gratitude. Mason sought him out during rehab, joking weakly that Reyes had stolen his thunder by doubling as the team's deadliest shot. Even Torres, pale and scarred but alive, muttered, "Guess I owe you twice over now, Doc." They said it lightly, half as humor, half as thanks. But Reyes felt the truth behind their words. The bond forged in that valley ran deeper than blood, deeper than duty. They weren't just brothers in arms anymore. They were men who had seen death together and chosen life for each other instead. And at the center of it was Reyes, the medic who had become something more. Months later, when the team finally rotated home, the valley still followed him. It surfaced in dreams, in the sharp pop of fireworks that sent his heart racing, in the way he scanned rooftops and ridgelines without thinking. He kept Cooper's rifle locked away, but sometimes he pulled it out, disassembled it piece by piece, and laid it across the table like a puzzle he couldn't stop solving. Some nights, he sat with it until dawn, staring at the steel and remembering the feel of the trigger under his finger, the recoil in his shoulder, the way enemies fell one by one through the scope. Each memory twisted inside him, a reminder of how survival had demanded a choice he could never take back. But he also remembered the voices. Carter's breath rasping back to life under his hands. Torres groaning, stubbornly alive. Mason cracking a joke through pain. Harris telling him, "Don't carry it heavier than you need to." Those voices mattered too. In the end, Reyes came to understand what Harris had meant. The rifle wasn't a curse. It was a burden. And burdens weren't meant to be escaped. They were meant to be carried. Years later, long after the valley had faded from headlines and reports, Reyes still found himself telling the story. Not to glorify it, not to make himself a legend, but to honor the men who had fought beside him. He spoke at memorials, to recruits, sometimes even to classrooms of wide-eyed kids who wanted to know what it meant to be a Navy SEAL. He told them about Cooper, the sniper who never missed, about Mason's grit, Carter's stubbornness, Torres's unbreakable will, about Harris, the leader who held them together when the valley tried to tear them apart. And when the questions inevitably came about his own role, about the medic who had become a sniper, Reyes always paused. He looked at the faces before him, then said the only truth that mattered. I wasn't the hero of that night. The team was. I just did what I had to, same as them. That's the thing about being part of a unit. You don't carry the fight alone. You carry it together. And sometimes that's the only reason you survive. The story never ended with him. It ended with all of them. Back under the stars, on nights when sleep wouldn't come, Reyes sometimes closed his eyes and heard the valley again, the gunfire, the cries, the echo of his own heartbeat. But he also heard Harris's voice, steady and unyielding. You honored him tonight. And slowly, painfully, he began to believe it. Because the legacy of that night wasn't death. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't even the shots he fired. It was the lives still breathing because he had chosen to pick up the rifle. And in the quiet of the desert, Reyes finally understood. That would always be enough.